The fluorescent lights in the garage flickered softly, their hum almost imperceptible beneath the low, steady murmur of the old refrigerator in the corner. Morty shifted uneasily, glancing over at the workbench where Rick had left a strange device, an odd cylindrical object that hummed with an unnatural energy. It was a typical afternoon, or so it seemed, but something in the air felt different today. There was a strange weight to the silence, a heaviness that Morty couldn't shake off. Rick was nowhere to be seen. Morty had been waiting for him to return from whatever dimension he'd wandered off to, but as the minutes dragged on, the unease settled into his bones like a cold draft. He glanced down at the strange machine again, unsure of whether he should touch it. Rick had always warned him about poking around his inventions, but today Morty couldn't help himself. The humming was almost inviting. His fingers brushed the surface of the device, and for a moment it felt like the world paused. The hum stopped abruptly and Morty froze. The silence felt wrong, like it had become too thick, too solid, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Then the lights flickered again, more violently this time, and Morty could have sworn he heard a faint scratching sound from behind him. He spun around, but the garage was empty. Just shadows stretching across the floor, the dim light casting long, eerie shapes against the walls. He shook his head, trying to laugh it off. It was just his imagination. He was probably just tired. After all, things like this didn't happen in the real world. But when he turned back to the machine, his stomach tightened. The cylinder had changed. Its surface was now covered in strange symbols, glowing faintly with a sickly green hue. Something wasn't right. Morty stepped back, his breath quickening as he looked around the garage. The air was thick, pressing against his chest, and the shadows seemed to move just out of the corner of his eye. There were sounds now, soft, almost imperceptible, like a whispering that had no source. The walls seemed to close in on him, the shelves creaking under the weight of unseen forces. He glanced at the doorway, wondering if he could make a break for it. But something made him stop. A cold shiver ran down his spine. The refrigerator in the corner was no longer humming. In fact, it was perfectly still, too still. A low growl echoed from somewhere deep within the walls, and Morty's heart skipped a beat. He knew that sound. He'd heard it before, in the darkest corners of the universes Rick had dragged him through. It was the sound of something that shouldn't be here, something that wasn't supposed to exist. "Rick," Morty called out, his voice barely more than a whisper. But the only response was the sound of the growling growing louder, closer. He could hear it moving now, something skittering, scratching against the walls, as if it was crawling towards him, drawn to his very presence. The garage, once a place of quiet comfort, now felt like a cage, its walls closing in, its floor shifting beneath him. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, twisting into forms that shouldn't be possible. The door opened suddenly, and Morty nearly jumped out of his skin. Rick stood in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes wide. There was something wrong about him. His usual chaotic energy was gone, replaced by a hollow, frantic look. "Morty, you have to get out of here!" Rick shouted, his voice shaking with panic. But it was too late. The machine on the workbench surged to life with a deafening crack, sending a burst of green light that filled the room. Morty screamed, shielding his eyes from the blinding glow, but even through his closed lids he could feel the heat searing through his skin. The ground beneath his feet buckled, and suddenly the walls seemed to collapse inward, as if the entire dimension itself was folding in on them. The growling reached a fever pitch, now accompanied by shrill, high-pitched shrieks. Morty opened his eyes just in time to see a figure, no, a creature, emerging from the shadows. It was like nothing he had ever seen before, a twisted amalgamation of flesh and bone, its form constantly shifting, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly malice. Rick reached out for him, but the creature was faster. It lunged, its jagged limbs extending impossibly long, wrapping around Rick's body with terrifying speed. Morty screamed, backing away, but the garage was no longer a garage. It was a tunnel, a void, stretching endlessly in all directions. And then, just as suddenly as it began, everything went quiet. The lights flickered once more before shutting off completely, leaving Morty in darkness. He could still hear the creature's movements, but now it was distant, like it was watching him from somewhere far beyond the walls. Morty's chest tightened, his breath shallow as he slowly turned around. Rick was gone. The workbench was empty, the strange device now nothing more than a burnt husk of metal. The refrigerator was humming again, just like it always had, as though nothing had ever happened. But Morty knew it wasn't the same. The room wasn't the same. He stepped toward the door, trembling. As his hand touched the doorknob, he froze. Through the crack in the doorway, he could see something in the distance. Shapes, moving in the shadows, always just out of sight. Something was still there, lurking, waiting. Morty turned the knob slowly.